MLB Power Pros!
Alright, so let's talk about making our first roster. So the first time you open up the PowerUp app, you'll see that the only roster available is the base roster. If you just open that roster, you'll see that nothing on the roster is editable. All of the players can't be replaced, the teams can't be replaced, the roster itself can't be renamed. It is what it is, and it can't be changed because it is a base type, which means that we can't edit it because we want it to be persisted as we make changes through the app. So, since we can't edit it directly, we're going to make a copy of it. So I'll make a copy of the base roster, and the first thing I'll do is I will change the name. I'll call it my custom roster, and then I'll hit the like icon to save it, and that will go ahead and save this as my custom roster. So next, let's say that I want to replace some players here on the Baltimore Orioles. You'll see that I can't replace any players yet because I cannot edit this team. The reason I can't edit it is because it's a base team, which means it was the version of the team from the original game. In order to edit it, we're going to replace it with a copy. So now we have a custom copy of the Baltimore Orioles that still has all base players, whereas a complete copy of the team. So now if we wanted to go in and edit its lineups, we can. But the other thing that we can do is we can start replacing players. So there's a few different options for how to replace players. The first is replace with copy. Like when we replace with copy in other places, this will allow players to be editable. So let's say that we want to create an editable copy of Aubrey Huff. We would say replace with copy, and now we have a custom version of Aubrey Huff with a new player ID and identical attributes to the original one. Another way that you can replace a player is to replace them with an existing player. This is a search dialog that lets you pick from any player that you have saved in your PowerUp database. So it could be anyone you've generated, anyone that you've created new, anyone that exists anywhere in the PowerUp app that you've created before or have at any point had will show up in this list. So let's say I search and I want to add, let's add Todd Helton to this team. We'll see that we have Todd Helton here. He's a base player, position's first base, and he's got player ID P71. I'll go ahead and select him, and now when I select him to replace with, he will now be added to the team. Another way to replace players is to replace with generated. We'll cover this more later, but essentially you would search in this dialog, pick a player, and pick a year, and you would generate that player. And finally, we have replace with new. And replace with new just creates a new default player and puts it in the place of the original player. So you'll see, to make it obvious, it's labeled new with an exclamation point. The reason that it showed up at the bottom here instead of in place where it was is because this reorders itself to always be in order of position. So catchers, it's just by position numbers. So catchers first, all the way up through 9 at right field, and then DH is basically 10. And then pitchers are in a separate section. So even though they would be first numerically, they just are listed in a separate section. So now we have a default player, and this player will have basically the default attributes. This is what the general AAA player will have in the game. So that is what we copied here for creating default players. If you do the same when you replace new with a pitcher, It'll be the same deal, but you will get a new pitcher. So in this pitcher will have the same default attributes that a AAA pitcher would have in the game. And this new here, this is just their saved name. It's just a placeholder to make it obvious that this is a brand new player and that you should probably edit them before you go to use them in the game. You can use them like this, they're just not going to be very good. Besides replacing players on specific teams, we can also replace the free agents on a roster. So here it's just a list of the free agents that will be available in the game from this roster, and we can do the same exact actions that we did for replacing players on teams to go ahead and replace players that are free agents. So I will just go ahead and add Miguel Cabrera to the free agent list just for the heck of it here. We can also replace all-stars. These can be players that exist somewhere else on the roster, like they would be in the game, or they can be players that don't exist anywhere else on the roster and only exist on the all-star team. So, for example, if I create a new player here, this player now doesn't belong to any particular team other than the all-star team. This will let you, if you want to, add up to 32 teams into the game. Two of them will be the American League and National League All-Stars, which in a season mode you wouldn't get to play with them, but just for exhibition games you would then have the option to play with those other two teams if you wanted to. Besides replacing specific players on a team, you can also replace teams with another team from your PowerUp database, or with any other sort of team that you generate. So the options are very similar to replacing a player. We showed earlier replacing with copy, which is a good way to make sure that you can make a editable version of a base team. You can also replace with existing. So let's say that for some reason we wanted to have, in place of the Baltimore Orioles, we want to have the New York Yankees. And we would now have the New York Yankees, all of their players, all of the players' attributes, and all of the lineups would get written onto the Baltimore Orioles. They'll still have the same jerseys, and this in parentheses is here to note that in Power Pros they will be written to the Baltimore Orioles, but this is the name of the team in the database. So for example, if we were to go in and say create a new team, we would then have team new, and we could go and edit its properties and make it whatever name we wanted it to, and that team could be named whatever we want here, but in the game those players are going to be written onto the Baltimore Orioles. And then lastly, just to touch on it, the last option for replacing the team is to replace with generated, and again we'll cover more about generation in a later video, but you can go ahead here and search for your team, select a franchise from here, type in a specific year of that team to generate, and you would be able to generate your team from this dialog. So hopefully that helps in terms of editing rosters and editing teams. Next time we'll get into more of the specifics about editing individual players.